With this watercolour of casting in a river, I've kept the masking on the figure and introduced a darker dry brush on the river. I've also introduced a pale violet lilac colour grey onto the rocks and used salt resist. And salt resist is a method of creating an effect, a textural effect, using dry table salt, and colour depends on how wet it is, the effect that you get. So trying some effects with dry table salt, leave it to dry in a radiator for a day or so, and then very sparingly sprinkle it onto this to achieve a textural effect. After the dry brush here, I've removed the masking fluid on the figure. So here's the figure. I've redrawn it a little bit. I want to try and reduce the impact of this line, so I'm going to wet this area very gently with the hake and then put a little colour, a blue-grey, onto that line so it's still there, I can still see it, but I would like it to reduce in impact, particularly further away from the figure, and maybe get a little bit stronger. In fact, just damping that will drag some colour over it very slightly, and I think that's enough to give a suggestion of the line. This part here can be perhaps lifted out a little bit later, the rod. Let's have a look at the figure for a moment. I wondered about a light flesh tone, which would be yellow ochre and crimson. So this is a mix of yellow ochre and crimson. I'm going to paint it all over the head, but leave that front bit of the face with light on it. And yellow ochre, crimson and ochre again on the hand, a little bit there, and on the other hand it seems to be gathering something. If I painted his jacket a little bit more of a yellow-green colour, I feel it would come forwards from the background. So this is wet on dry. I'm trying to think of the creases and folds in the jacket that might give us a suggestion of the cylindrical nature of the arm, this kind of thing. So it's mark making. I'll leave that to dry and put another layer on for shadow on the cloth fabric. I'm going to switch that to an ochre mix with ultramarine, slightly different colours. For the waders, maybe a little more dark, but again it's a cylinder, the leg approximately, so that's a kind of curving mark that would describe the cylinder of the leg. There's a little bit of water foaming up around his leg, his right leg there, so I'm going to try and leave that edge out. And presumably has got two legs, so this would be the other one, something like that. Okay, I'm going to leave a little bit of light there and just a trace of light of water passing around the base of the leg. The catch bag, I'll give maybe a darker blue-grey colour. This is ultramarine with a little ochre and crimson, just to try and separate these areas one from each other. So by now that should have dried off a little bit. Let's see if I can get that to go round there. Just left out his other arm for a moment, so let's put that in. So it's light against dark here with this. That's also a cylinder, so trying to give as much description in the figure as possible, because there isn't much definition elsewhere in the image. And his hat would probably be similar. There's fairly monochrome colours in all of his costume. Grey, a little bit of leaving out, and leave out on the peak and on the top of the hat to represent light. His hair, when this is dried, I feel would be useful to have. This is not in the photograph. To give a suggestion of profile, to leave out for the ear a little bit there, and I think probably leave that alone. So I've darkened these colours slightly with a little bit of ultramarine to try and work a little bit into the shadow in the body, assuming that's quite bulky. So the torso is also vaguely cylindrical, so you'd get shadows or creases coming around the figure like that, and shadow creases in the leggings. Again, a cylindrical shape. Probably leave that alone. Now let's have a look at the foreground. So the foreground, I have rocks I've given salt resist and allowed to dry, and I've mixed up some darker, masked there are some ferns rather in here, masked those. So I'd quite like to be able to show some of the 3D form in the rocks just by painting into the darker shapes. So the initial layer was a violety grey with ultramarine and crimson and less ochre and quite a lot of water. And I'm hoping that the salt resist texture will pick up on the translucent washes that I'm putting on now. So instead of being flat, this will have a little bit of rocky texture. So there were ferns in here. The upward facing surfaces of rock seem to have a little bit of light on them, although the whole of this foreground seems to be in shadow, so that means it all ought to be more muted than the sunlit areas in the middle distance. And this control of tone, having less contrast here and more contrast over there, puts the emphasis on the central figure. So the ferns I've masked, redrew. There are some little slivers of highlight in here, of rock that just catch the light. It'd be nice to try and preserve very chunky rock. Let's try and paint into this, but leave an edge. Again, leave an edge there, a lit edge possibly. This is ultramarine, ochre and crimson, just darker than the mix used. There is local colour as well as tone, which is the darkness of possibly algae from the river. So let's look at this area here, coming up there. With this technique, I can't rework an area too much because this watercolour is resoluble. So I have to put some colour down and leave it to dry. I'm going to do another layer and do it on dry. So just little bits of light that catch on the upward facing surfaces. And these sides, that's why I've redrawn this, are generally a bit darker. It's a bit darker there. And all of this, it's a bit darker, lots of water on the brush so the colour flows well off the brush and doesn't leave, or lift rather. Doesn't matter about the odd little leftover bit. So that's in shadow, all that downward facing bit of rock. And this is in shadow too. So it's typical of watercolour to be painting to leave out in this foreground. Yeah, so there probably is more that could be done with that foreground to create more contrast, but I'm hoping that achieves a sense of distance, that the focus is on the figure, this is a little bit out of focus, and when that has dried fully I would use an eraser to try and create the effect of sunlight coming across here, these beams of sunlight. So if we take a plastic rubber, that should begin to create the effect of a shaft of sunlight. It does take a little while to build up that, and you do have to have the right. That's a bit harder. Yeah, that's it. The right rubber. So you can see that's lifted out a little bit there, and it's repeating that a few times on top, and leave the whole thing to dry.